Jonesy! Beaver shouted. Hey, Jonesy! This time there's a response, faint but unmistakable. The snowmobile shed was kind of a ground-level attic, and one of the things out there was an old-fashioned bulb horn, the kind a bicycle delivery man back in the 20s or 30s might have mounted on the handlebars of his bike. Now Beaver heard it. Ooga! Ooga! A noise that would have surely made Durrets laugh until he cried, a sucker for big juicy noises that have been the old duds. The filmy blue shower curtain rustled, and the Beav's arms broke out in the lush bundles of goose flesh. For a moment he almost leaped up, thinking that it was McCarthy, then realized he'd brushed the curtain with his own elbow. It was close quarters in there, close quarters no doubt, and settled back. Still nothing from beneath him, though that thing, whatever it was either dead or gone, for certain. Well, almost for certain. The Beav reached behind him, fingered the flush lever for a moment, then let its hand fall away. Sit tight, Jonesy had said, and Beaver would. But why the fuck didn't Jonesy come back? If he couldn't find the tape, why didn't he just come back without it? It had been at least 10 minutes now, didn't it? And felt like a fucking hour. Meanwhile here, he sat on the john with the dead man in the tub beside him. One who looked as if his ass has been blown up by dynamite. Man, talk about having to take a shit. Beep the horn again, at least, Beaver muttered. Honk that Jeesley thing, let me know you're still there. But Jonesy didn't. Jonesy couldn't find the tape. He looked everywhere and couldn't find it anywhere. He knew it had to be there. It wasn't hanging from any of the nails, and it wasn't on the tool-littered work table. It wasn't behind the paint cans or on the hook beneath the old painting masks that hung there by their yellowing elastics. He looked under the table, looked in the boxes stacked against the far wall, then in the compartment under the Arctic Cat's passenger seat. There was a spare headlight in there, still in its carton, and half a pack of ancient Lucky Strikes, but no goddamn tape. He could feel the minutes ticking away. Once he was pretty sure he heard the Beav call for him, but he didn't want to go back without the tape, so he blew the old horn that was lying on the floor, pumped its cracked black rubber horn and making a ooga ooga sound that Duds no doubt would have loved. The more he looked for the tape and didn't find it, the more imperative it seemed. There was a ball of twine, but how could you tie down a toilet seat with twine, for Christ's sake? And there was Scotch tape in one of the kitchen drawers. He was almost sure of it, but the thing in the toilet had sounded pretty strong, like a good-sized fish or something. Scotch tape just wasn't as good enough. Jonesy stood beside the Arctic Cat, looking around with wide eyes, running his hands through his hair. He hadn't put his gloves back on. He'd been out there long enough to numb his fingers, breathing out white puffs of vapor. Where the fuck? He asked aloud and slammed his fist down on the table. A stack of little boxes filled with nails and screws fell over when he did. And there was the friction tape behind them, a big fat roll of it. He must have looked right past it a dozen times. He grabbed it, stuffed it in his coat pocket. He had remembered to put that on at least, although he hadn't bothered to zip it up, and turned to go. And that was when Beaver began to scream. His calls had been barely there, but Jonesy had no trouble at all hearing the screams. They were big, lusty, filled with pain. Jonesy sprinted for the door. Beaver's mom had always said the toothpicks would kill him, but she had never imagined anything like this. Sitting there on the closed toilet seat, Beaver felt in the bib pocket of his overalls for a pick to chew on. But there weren't any. They were all scattered all over the floor. 2-3 had landed clear of the blood, but he'd had to rise up the toilet seat a little to get them. Rise up and lean forward. Beaver debated. Sit tight, Jonesy had said, but surely the thing in the toilet was gone. Dive, 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 as they said in the submarine war movies. Even if it wasn't, he'd be lifting his ass only for a second or two. If the thing jumped, Beaver could bring his weight right back down again. maybe break his scaly little neck for it, always assuming it had one. He looked longingly at the toothpicks. 3 or 4 were close enough so he could reach down and pick them up. But he wasn't going to put that bloody toothpicks in his mouth, especially considering where the blood had come from. There was something else too. That funny furry stuff was growing on the blood, growing in the gutters of grout between the tiles as well. He could see it more clearly than ever. It was on some of the toothpicks too, but not on those which had fallen clear of the blood. Those were clean and white, and if he had ever in his life needed the comfort of something in his mouth, a little piece of wood to gnaw on, it was now. "Fuck it," the Beav murmured and leaned forward, reaching out. His stretching fingers came up just short of the nearest clean pick. He flexed the muscles of his thighs and his butt came up off the seat. His fingers closed on the toothpick. "Ah, got it!" And something hit the closed lid of the toilet seat at that moment. Hit it with terrifying force, driving it up into its unprotected balls and knocking him forward. Beaver grabbed at the shower curtain in the last-ditch effort to maintain his balance, but it pulled free of the bar in a metallic clitter-clack of rings. His boots slipped in the blood, and he went sprawling forward onto the floor like a man blown out of an ejection seat. Behind him, he heard the toilet seat fly up hard enough to crack the porcelain tank. Something wet and heavy landed on Beaver's back. Something that felt like a tail or a worm or a muscular segmented tentacle curled between his legs and seized his already aching balls in a contracting python's grip. Beaver screamed, chin lifting from his bloody tiles. A red crisscross pattern tattooed faintly on his chin, eyes bulging. The thing lay wet and cold and heavy from the nape of his neck to the small of his back, like a rolled-up breathing rug, and now it began to utter a feverish, high-pitched, chittering noise, the noise of a rabid monkey. Beaver screamed again, wriggled toward the floor on his belly, then lurched up, onto all fours, trying to shake the thing off. The muscular rope between his legs squeezed again, and there was a low popping sound from somewhere in the liquid haze of pain that was now his groin. "Oh, Christ," the Beav thought. "Mighty Christ, bananas, I think that was one of my balls." Squealing, sweating, tongue dancing in and out of his mouth like a demented party favor, Beav did the only thing he could think of. Rolled over onto his back, trying to crush whatever it was between his spine and the tiles. It chittered in his ear, almost deafening him, and began to wriggle frantically. Beaver seized the tail, curled between his legs, smooth and hairless on top, thorny as if plated with hooks made of clotted hair underneath. And wet, water, blood, both. "Oh, God, let go! Fucking thing, let go! Jesus, my fucking sack! Jesus!" Before he could get either hand beneath the tail, a mouthful of needles sank into the side of his neck. He reared up, bellowing, and then the thing was gone. Beaver tried to get to his feet. He had to push with his hands because there was no strength in his legs, and his hands kept slipping. In addition to McCarthy's blood, the bathroom floor was now covered with murky water from the cracked toilet tank, and the tiled surface was a skating rink. As he finally got up, he saw something clinging to the doorway about halfway up. It looked like some kind of freak weasel, no legs, but with a thick, reddish gold tail. There was no real head, only a kind of slippery-looking node from which 2 feverish black eyes started. The lower half of the node split open, revealing a nest of teeth. The thing struck at Beaver like a snake, the node lashing forward. The hairless tail curled around the door jamb. Beaver screamed and raised a hand in front of his face. 3 of the 4 fingers on it. All but the pinky disappeared. There was no pain, either that or the pain from his ruptured testicle swallowed it whole. He tried to step away, but the backs of his knees struck the bowl of the battered toilet. There was nowhere to go. That thing was in him? Beaver thought. There was time for that much. It was in him? Then it coiled its tail or its tentacle or whatever it was and leaped at him. the top half of his rudimentary head full of its stupidly furious black eyes, the lower half a packet of bone needles. Far away in some other universe where there still might be sane life, Jonesy was calling his name, but Jonesy was late. Jonesy was very late. The thing that had been in McCarthy landed on Beav's chest with a smack. It smelled like McCarthy's wind, a heavy reek of oil and ether and methane gas. The muscular whip that was its lower body wrapped around Beaver's waist. Its head darted forward, and its teeth closed on Beaver's nose. Screaming, beating at it with his fists, Beaver fell backward onto the toilet. The ring and the lid had flown up against the tank when the thing came out. The lid had stayed up, but the ring had fallen back into place. Now the Beav landed on it, broke it, and dropped ass first into the toilet with the weasel thing clutching him around the waist and chewing his face. "Beaver! Beav! What?" Beaver felt the thing stiffen against him. It literally stiffened, like a dick getting hard. The grip of the tentacle around his waist tightened, then loosened. Its black-eyed, idiotic face whipped around toward the sound of Jonesy's voice, and Beav saw his old friend through a haze of blood, and with dimming eyes. Jonesy standing, slack-jawed in the doorway, a roll of friction tape. Won't need that now, Beaver thought. Nah. In that one dangling hand, Jonesy standing there, utterly defenseless in a shocked horror. This thing's next meal. "Jonesy, get out of here!" Beaver shouted. His voice was wet, strained through a mouthful of blood. He sensed the thing getting ready to leap and wrapped his arms around its pulsing body as if it were his lover. "Get out! Shut the door!" "Burn it," he wanted to say. "Lock it in. Lock both of us in. Burn it. Burn it alive. I'm going to sit here ass deep in his fucking toilet with my arms wrapped around it, and if I can die smelling it roast, I can die happy." But the thing was struggling too hard, and fucking Jonesy was just standing there with that roll of friction tape in his hand, and his jaw dropped. And goddamn, if he hadn't looked like Duddits, dumb as a stone boat and never going to improve. The thing turned back to Beaver, its earless, noseless node of a head drawn back. And before that head darted forward and the world detonated for the last time, Beaver had a final partial thought. "Those toothpicks, damn! Mama always said." Then the exploding red and blooming black, and somewhere far off the sound of his own screams, the final ones. Jonesy saw Beaver sitting in the toilet with something that looked like a giant red gold worm clinging to him. He called out, and the thing turned toward him. No real head, just the black eyes of a shark and a mouthful of teeth. Something in the teeth, something that couldn't be the mangled remains of Beaver Clarendon's nose, but probably was. "Run away," he screamed at himself, and then, "Save him! Save Beaver!" Both imperatives had equal power, and the result kept him frozen in the doorway, feeling as if he weighed 1,000 pounds. The thing in Beaver's arms was making a noise. A crazed, chattering sound that got into his head and made him think of something from a long time ago. He didn't know just what. Then Beaver was screaming at him from his awkward sprawl in the toilet, telling him to get out, to shut the door, and the thing turned back to the sound of his voice as if recalled to temporarily forgotten business, and it was Beaver's eyes it went for this time. His fucking eyes. Beaver, writhing and screaming and trying to hold on as the thing chittered and chattered and bit. Its tail or whatever it was flexing and tightening around Beaver's waist, pulling Beaver's shirt out of his overalls and then slithering inside against his bare skin. Beaver's feet jerking on the tiles, the heels of his boots spraying bloody water in thin sheets, his shadow flailing on the wall, and that mossy stuff was everywhere now. It grew so fucking fast. Jonesy saw Beaver thrash backward in a final throw, saw the thing let go its grip and leap clear, just as the Beav rolled off the toilet, his upper half falling into the tub on top of McCarthy. The old, "Mr. Behold, I stand at the door and knock." The thing hit the floor and slithered around. Christ, it was quick and started toward him. Jonesy took a step backward and swept the bathroom door shut just before the thing hit it, making a thump almost exactly like the one it had made when it hit the underside of the toilet seat. It hit hard, enough to shiver the door against the jamb. Light flickered in shutters from beneath the door as it moved restlessly on the tiles, and then it slammed into the door again. Jonesy's first thought was to run and get a chair, put it under the doorknob, but how dumb was that? As his kid said, how fucking brainless, the door opened in, not out. The real question was whether the thing understood the function of the doorknob, and if it could reach it. As if it had read his mind, and who could say that was impossible? There was a slithering sound on the other side of the door, and it felt the doorknob, trying to turn. Whatever the thing was, it was incredibly strong. Jonesy had been holding the knob with his right hand, and now he held his left as well. There was a bad moment where the pressure on the knob continued to mount. When he felt sure the thing in there would be able to turn the knob in spite of his doubled grip, and Jonesy almost panicked, almost turned and ran. What stopped him was his memory of how quick it was. It had run me down before I could get halfway across the room, he thought, wondering in the back of his mind why the room had to be so goddamn big in the first place. It had run me down, go up my leg, and then up my... Jonesy redoubled his grip on the doorknob. Cords standing out on his forearms, on the sides of his neck, lips skinned back to show his teeth. His hip hurt too. His goddamn hip. If he tried to run, his hip would slow him down. Even more thanks to the retired professor. Fucking elderly asshole. Couldn't have been driving in the first place. Thanks a lot, Professor. Thanks a fucking pantload. And if he couldn't hold the door shut, he couldn't run. What then? What had happened to Beaver, of course? It had the beaver's nose stuck in its teeth like a shish kebab. Moaning, Jonesy held the knob. For a moment, the pressure increased even more, and then it stopped. From behind the thin wood of the door, the thing yammered angrily. Jonesy could smell the ethery aroma of starter fluid. How was it holding on in there? It had no limbs. Not that Jonesy had been able to see, just that reddish tail thing. So how... He heard the minute crackle-crunch splinter of wood on the other side of the door, directly in front of his own head by the sound, and knew. It was clinging by its teeth. The idea filled Jonesy with unreasoning horror. That thing had been inside McCarthy. He had absolutely no doubt of it. Inside McCarthy and growing like a giant tapeworm in a horror movie. Like cancer, one with teeth. And when it had grown enough, when it was ready to go to bigger and better things, you might say, it had simply chewed its way out. "No, man, no!" Jonesy said in a watery, almost weeping voice. The knob on the bathroom door began trying to turn the other way. Jonesy could see it in there, on the side of the bathroom door, bat into the wood like a leech with its teeth, its tail or single tentacle wrapped around the doorknob like a loop ending in a hangman's noose. Pulling. "No, no, no!" Jonesy panted, hanging onto the knob with all his strength. It was the verge of slipping away from him. It was the sweat on his face and on his palms too. He could feel it. In front of his bulging, frightened eyes, a constellation of bumps appeared in the wood. Those were its teeth, were planted and working deeper at the time. Soon the points would burst through. If he didn't lose the grip on the doorknob first, that was. And he'd actually have to look at the fangs that had torn his friend's nose off his face. That brought it home to him. Beaver was dead, his old friend. "You killed him!" Jonesy cried at the thing on the other side of the door. His voice quivered with sorrow and terror. "You killed the Beav!" His cheeks were hot, the tears which now began to course down them even hotter. Beaver in his black leather jacket. "What a lot of zippers!" Durrett's mom had said on the day they met her. Beaver next door to shit-faced at the senior prom, dancing like a Cossack, arms folded across his chest and his feet kicking. Beaver at Jonesy and Carla's wedding reception, hugging Jonesy and whispering fiercely in his ear, "You got to be happy, man. You got to be happy for all of us." And that had been the first. He knew that Beaver wasn't. Henry and Peter, of course, about them, there had never been a question. But the Beav? And now Beaver was dead. Beaver was lying half in and half out of the tub, lying noseless on top of Mr. Richard, fucking I stand at the door and knock, McCarthy. "You killed him, you fuck!" he shouted at the bulges in the door. There had been 6 of them, and now there were 9. Hell, a dozen. As if surprised by his rage, the widowshin's pressure on the doorknob eased again. Jonesy looked around wildly for anything that might help him. Saw nothing, then looked down. The roll of friction tape was there. He might be able to bend and snatch it up, but then what? He would need both hands to pull lengths of tape off it. Both hands and his teeth to rip them, and even supposing the thing gave him time, what was the good of it, when he could barely hold the doorknob still against its pressure? And now the knob began to turn again. Jonesy held it on his side, but he was getting tired now. The adrenaline in his muscles starting to decay and turn to lead. His palms more slippery than ever, and that smell, the ethery smell, was clearer now and somehow purer, untainted by the waste and the gases of McCarthy's body. And how it could be so strong on this side of the door? How could it, unless, in the half-second or so, before the rod connecting the doorknobs on the inside and outside of the bathroom door snapped, Jonesy became aware that it was darker now. Just a little, as if someone had crept up behind him, was standing between him and the light, him and the back door. The rod snapped. The knob in Jonesy's hand pulled free, and the bathroom door immediately swung in a little, pulled by the weight of the eelish thing clinging to it. Jonesy shrieked and dropped the knob. It hit the roll of tape and bounced askew. He turned to run, and there stood a grey man. It was a stranger, but in a way no stranger at all. Jonesy had seen representations of him on 100 Weird Mysteries TV shows on the front pages of 1,000 tabloid newspapers, the kind that shouted the serio-comic horrors at you as you stood prisoner in the supermarket checkout lanes, in movies like E.T. and Close Encounters and Fire in the Sky. Mr. Grey, who was an X-Files staple. All the images had gotten the eyes right, at least. Those huge black eyes were just like the eyes of that thing that had chewed its way out of McCarthy's ass. And the mouth was closed, a vestigial slit, no more than that. But its grey skin hung in loose folds and swags, like the skin of an elephant dying of old age. From the wrinkles there ran listless yellow-white streams of some pussy substance. Same stuff ran like tears from the corners of its expressionless eyes. Clots and smears of it puddled across the floor of the big room, across the Navajo rug beneath the Dreamcatcher, back toward the kitchen door through which it had entered. How long had Mr. Grey been there? Had he been outside, watching Jonesy run from the snowmobile shed to the back door with the useless roll of friction tape in his hand? He only knew that Mr. Grey was dying, and Jonesy had to get past him, because the thing in the bathroom had just dropped onto the floor with a heavy thud. It would be coming for him. "Marcy!" Mr. Grey said. He spoke with perfect clarity, although the vestige of the mouth never moved. Jonesy heard the word in the middle of its head, in the same precise place where he had always heard Duddits crying. "What do you want?" The thing in the bathroom slithered across his feet, but Jonesy barely noticed it, curled between the bare toeless feet of the grey man. "Please stop," Mr. Grey said inside Jonesy's head. It was the click. More, it was the line. Sometimes you saw the line, sometimes you heard it, as he has heard the run of Defuniak's guilty thoughts that time. "I can't stand it. Give me a shot. Where's Marcy?" Death looking for me that day, Jonesy thought. Missed me in the street, missed me in the hospital, if only by a room or two. Been looking ever since. Finally got me. And then the thing's head exploded, tore wide open. releasing a red-orange cloud of ether-smelling particles. Jonesy breathed them in. Roberta. With her hair now all grey, a widow at 58, but still a birdie woman who favoured flowered print dresses, those things hadn't changed. Duddit's mother sat in front of the television in the ground floor apartment in the West Derry Acres, which she and her son now shared. She had sold the house on Maple Lane after Alfie died. She could have afforded to keep it. Alfie had left plenty of money, the life insurance had paid out plenty more, and there was her share of the imported auto parts company he'd started in 1975 on top of that. But it was too big, and there were too many memories above and below the living room where she and Duddits spent most of their time. Above the bedroom where she and Alfie had slept and talked, made plans and made love. Below the rec room where Duddits and his friends had spent so many afternoons and evenings. In Roberta's view, they had been friends sent from heaven. Angels with kind hearts and dirty mouths who had actually expected her to believe that when Duddits started to say "fut," he was trying to say "fud," which they explained earnestly was the name of Pete's new puppy. Elmer Fudd, or Fudd for sure. And of course she had pretended to believe this. Too many memories, too many ghosts of happier times. And then, of course, Duddits had gotten sick. 2 years now he'd been sick, and none of his old friends knew because they didn't come around anymore. And she hadn't had the heart to pick up the phone and call Beav, who would have called the others. And now she sat in front of the TV where the local news folks had finally given up just breaking into her afternoon stories and had gone on the air full time. Roberta listened, afraid of what might be happening up north, but fascinated too. The scariest part was that no one seemed to know exactly what was happening, or what the story was, or how big it was. There were missing hunters, maybe as many as a dozen, in the remote area of Maine, 150 miles north of Derry. That part was clear enough. Roberta wasn't positive, but she was quite sure that the reporters were talking about Jefferson Tract, where the boys used to go hunting, coming back with bloody stories that both fascinated Duddits and frightened him. Were those hunters just cut off by an Alberta clipper storm that had passed through, dropping 6 or 8 inches of snow on that area? Maybe. No one could say for sure, but one party of 4 had been hunting in the Kenyo area really did seem to be missing. Their pictures were flashed on the screen, their names recited solemnly. Otis, Roper, McCarthy, Shue. The last was a woman. Missing hunters weren't big enough to warrant interrupting the afternoon soaps, but there was other stuff too. People had glimpsed strange, vari-colored lights in the sky. 2 hunters from Millinocket, who had been in the Kenyo area 2 days before, claimed to have seen a cigar-shaped object hovering over a power line cut in the woods. There had been no rotors on the craft, they said, and no visible means of propulsion. It simply hung there for about 20 feet above the power lines, emitting a deep hum that buzzed in your bones. And in your teeth, it seemed. Both of the hunters claimed to have lost teeth, although when they have opened their mouths to display the gaps, Roberta had thought the rest of the teeth looked ready to fall out as well. The hunters had been in the old Chevy pickup, and when they tried to drive closer for a better look, their engine had died. One of the men had a battery-powered watch that had run backward for about 3 hours following the event and then quit for good. The other's watch, the old-fashioned wind-up kind, had been fine. According to the reporter, a number of other hunters and area residents had been seeing unidentified flying objects, some cigar-shaped, some of more traditional saucer shape, for the last week or so. The military slang for such an outbreak of sightings, the reporter said, was a flap. Missing hunters, UFOs, juicy and certainly good enough to lead with Live at 6. Local, late-breaking, your town and your state. But now there was more. There was worse. Still only rumors to be sure, and Roberta prayed they would prove to be untrue, but creepy enough to have kept her here for almost 2 hours now, drinking too much coffee and growing more and more nervous. The scariest rumors clustered around reports that something had crash-landed in the woods, not far from where the men had reported the cigar-shaped craft hovering over the power lines. Almost as disquieting were reports that a fairly large area of Aroostook County, perhaps 200 square miles, mostly owned by the paper companies or the government, had been quarantined. A tall, pale man with deep-set eyes spoke briefly to reporters at the Air National Guard base in Bangor. He stood in front of the sign which proclaimed "Home of the Maniacs," and said that none of the rumors were true, but that a number of conflicting reports were being checked. The super beneath him read simply Abraham Kurds. Roberta couldn't tell what his rank was, or indeed if he was really a military man at all. He was dressed in a simple green coverall with nothing on it but a zipper. But he was cold. You would have thought so. Wearing nothing but that coverall, he didn't show it. There was something in his eyes that were very large and fringed like white lashes that Roberta didn't much like. They looked to her like liar's eyes. "Can you at least confirm that the downed aircraft is neither foreign nor extraterrestrial in origin?" a reporter asked. He sounded young. "E.T. phone home," Kurd said and laughed. There was laughter from most of the other reporters as well, and no one except Roberta, watching the clip here in the West Derry Acres apartment, seemed to realize that was not an answer at all. "Can you confirm that there was no quarantine in the area of the Jefferson Tract?" another reporter asked. "I can neither confirm nor deny that at this time," Kurd said. "We are taking this matter quite seriously. Your government dollars are working really hard today, ladies and gentlemen." He then walked away toward a helicopter with slowly turning rotors and ANG printed on the side with big white letters. That clip had been videotaped at 9:45 a.m., according to the news anchor. The next clip, shaky footage from a handheld video camera, has been taken from a Cessna chartered by Channel 9 News to overfly the Jefferson Tract. The air had obviously been bumpy and there was a lot of snow, but not enough to obscure the 2 helicopters which had appeared and flanked the Cessna on either side like big brown dragonflies. There was a radio transmission, so blurry that Roberta needed to read the transcript printed in yellow at the bottom of the TV screen. "This area is interdicted. You are ordered to turn back to your point of flight origination. Repeat, this area is interdicted. You are ordered to turn back to your point of flight origination." Did interdicted mean the same as quarantined? Roberta Cavell thought it probably did. Although she also thought fellas like "Man Kurds" might quibble. The letters on the flanking helicopters were clearly visible. ANG. One of them might have been the very one that took Abraham Kurds north. Cessna pilot: "Under whose orders has this operation been carried out?" Radio: "Turn back, Cessna, or you will be forced to turn back." The Cessna had turned back. It had been low on fuel anyway. The news anchor reported as if that explained everything. Since then, they had just been rehashing the same stuff and calling it updates. The major networks supposedly had correspondence en route. She was getting up to turn the TV off. Watching had begun to make her nervous when Duddits screamed. Roberta's heart stopped in her chest, then jackrabbited into double time. She whirled around, bumping the table by the lazy boy which had been Alfie's and was now hers, overturning her coffee cup. It soaked the TV guide, drowning the cast of The Sopranos in a puddle of brown. The scream was followed by high, hysterical sobbing, the sobs of a child. But that was the thing about Duddits. He was in his 30s now. But he would die a child, long before he turned 40. For a moment, all she could do was stand still. At last she got moving, wishing that Alfie were here, or even better, one of the boys. Not that any one of them were boys now, of course, only Duddits was still a boy. Down's syndrome had never turned him into Peter Pan, and soon he would die in Never Never Land. "I'm coming, Daddy," she called, and so she was, but she felt old to herself as she went hurrying down the hall to the back bedroom, her heart banging leakily against her ribs, arthritis pinging her hips. No Neverland for her. "Coming! Mommy's coming!" sobbing and sobbing as if her heart had broken. He had cried out the first time he realized his gums were bleeding after he brushed his teeth. But he had never screamed, and it had been years since he'd cried like this. The kind of wild sobbing that got into your head and tore at your brains. Thump and hum, thump and hum, thump and hum. "Daddy, what is it?" She burst into the room and looked at him, wide-eyed. So convinced he must be hemorrhaging at first, she actually saw blood. But there was only Duddits, rocking back and forth in his crank-up hospital bed, cheeks wet with tears. His eyes were the same old brilliant green, but the rest of the color was gone. His hair was gone too. His lovely blonde hair that had reminded her of the young Art Garfunkel. The faint winter weight coming in through the window gleamed on his skull. Gleamed on the bottles ranked on the bedside table, pills for infection, pills for pain, but no pills that would stop what was happening to him or even slow it down. Gleamed on the ivy pole standing in front of the table. But there was nothing wrong that she could see, nothing that would account for the almost grotesque expression of pain on his face. She sat down beside him, captured the restlessly whipping head and held it to her bosom. Even now, in his agitation, his skin was cool. His exhausted, drying blood could bring no heat to his face. She remembered reading Dracula long ago back in high school, the pleasurable terror that had been quite a bit less pleasurable once she was in bed. Lights out, her room filled with shadows. She remembered being very glad there were no real vampires, except now she knew different. There was at least one, and it was far more terrifying than any Transylvanian count. Its name wasn't Dracula, but leukemia, and there was no stake you could put through its heart. "Duddits! Daddy, honey, what is it?" And he screamed it out as he lay against her breast, making her forget all about what might or might not be happening up in the Jefferson Tract, freezing her scalp of her skull and making her skin crawl and horripilate. "Ear, oh, Alma, ear." There was no need to ask him to say it again, to say it more clearly. She had been listening to him all her life, and she knew well enough. Beaver's dead. Beaver's dead. Oh, Mama, Beaver's dead. Pete and Becky. Pete lay screaming in the snow-covered rut where he had landed until he could scream no more. And then just lay there for a while, trying to cope with the pain, to find some way to compromise with it. He couldn't. This was no compromise pain, blitzkrieg agony. He had no idea the world had such pain. Had he known, surely he would have stayed with the woman, with Marcy, although Marcy wasn't her name. He almost knew her name, but what did it matter? He was the one who was in trouble here. The pain coming up from his knee in baked spasms, hot and terrible. He lay shivering in the road with the plastic bag beside him. "Thanks for shopping at our place," on the side. Pete reached for it, wanting if there was a bottle or two in there that wasn't broken, and his leg shifted. A bolt of agony flew up from the knee. It made the others feel like twinges. Pete screamed again and passed out. He didn't know how long he'd been out when he came to, but his feet were numb and his hands were going as well, in spite of the gloves. Pete lay partially turned to his side, the beer bag lying beside him in a puddle of freezing amber slush. The pain in his knee has receded a little. Probably that was numbing up too. And he found he could think again. That was good because this was a fucking pisser he'd gotten himself into here. He had to get back to the lean-to and the fire, and he had to do it on his own. If he simply lay there waiting for Henry and the snowmobile, he was apt to be a Peterskull when Henry arrived, a Peterskull with a bag of busted beer bottles beside him. "Thank you for shopping at our place, you fucking alcoholic. Thanks a lot." And there was the woman to think of. She might die too. And all because Pete Moore had to save his brewskis. He looked at the bag with distaste. Couldn't throw it into the woods, couldn't risk waking his knee up again. So he covered it with snow, like a dog covering his own scat, and he began to crawl. The knee wasn't that numb after all, it seemed. Pete crawled on his elbows and pushed with his good foot. Teeth clenched, hair hanging in his eyes. No animals now, the stampede had stopped, and there was only him. The gaspy sound of his breathing and the stifled moans of pain each time his knee bumped. He could feel sweat running down his arms and back, but his feet remained numb, and so did his hands. He might have given up, but halfway along the straight stretch he caught sight of a fire he and Henry had made. It had burned down considerably, but it was still there. Pete began to crawl toward it, and each time he bumped his leg and the bolts of agony came, he tried to project them into the orange spark of the fire. He wanted to get there. It hurt like blue perfect hell to move, but oh how he wanted to get there. He didn't want to die, freezing to death in the snow. "I'll make it, Becky," he muttered. "I'll make it, Becky." He spoke her name half a dozen times before he heard himself using it. As he approached the fire, he paused to glance at the watch and frowned. It said 11:40 or thereabouts, and that was nuts. He remembered checking it before starting back to the Scout. And it had said 20 past 12 then. A slightly longer look revealed the source of the confusion. His watch was running backward, the second hand moving counterclockwise in irregular, spasmodic jerks. He looked at this without much surprise. His ability to appreciate anything so fine as mere peculiarity had passed. Even his leg was no longer his chief concern. He was very cold, and big shudders began to course his body as he elbowed his way and pushed with his rapidly tiring good leg, covering the last 50 yards to the dying fire. The woman was no longer on the top. She now lay on the far side of the fire, as if she had crawled toward the remaining wood and then collapsed. "Hi, honey, I'm home," he panted. "Had a little trouble with my knee, but now I'm back. Goddamn knee's your fault anyway, Becky, so don't complain, all right? Becky, is that your name?" Maybe, but she made no response. Just lay there staring. He could see only one of her eyes, although whether it was the same one or the other one he didn't know. Didn't seem so creepy now, but maybe that was because he had other things to worry about, like the fire. It was guttering, but there was a good bed of coals, and he thought he was in time. Get some wood on that, sweetheart, really build her up, then lie here with his gal Becky. But upwind, please God, those bangers were bad. Wait for Henry to show up? Wouldn't be the first time Henry had pulled his nuts out of the fire. Pete crawled toward the woman and the little stockpile of wood beyond her. And as he got close enough to start picking that ethery, chemical smell again, he understood why her gaze no longer bothered him. That creepy jackalope look had gone out of it. Everything had. She'd crawled halfway around the fire and died. The crusting of snow around her waist and hips had gone a dark red. Pete stopped for a moment upon his aching arms and peered at her. But his interest in her, dead or alive, was not much more than the passing interest he'd felt in his back-turning watch. What he wanted to do was get some wood on the fire and get warm. He would consider the problem of the woman later. Next month, maybe, when he was sitting in his own living room with a cast on his knee and a cup of hot coffee in his hand. He finally made it to the wood. Only 4 pieces were left, but they were big pieces. Henry might be back before they burned down, and Henry would pick up some more before going on to get help. Good old Henry, still wearing his dorky horn rims, even in this age of soft contacts and laser surgery, but you could count on him. Pete's mind tried to return to Scout. Crawling into the Scout and smelling the cologne Henry had not, in fact, been wearing, and he wouldn't let it. Let's not get there. As the kids said, if memory was a destination, no more ghost cologne, no more memories of Duddits, no more, no bounds, no more, no play. He had enough on his plate already. He threw the wood onto the fire 1 branch at a time, side-arming the pieces awkwardly, wincing at the pain in his knee, but enjoying the way the sparks rose in a cloud, whirling beneath the lean-to canted tin ceiling like fireflies before winking out. Henry would be back soon. That was the thing to hold on to. Just watch the fire blaze up and hold that thought. No, he won't, because things have gone back at hole in the wall. Something to do with Rick, he said, watching the flames taste the new wood. Soon they would feed and grow tall. He stripped off his gloves, used his teeth, and held his hands to the warmth of the fire. The cut on the pad of his right hand, where the busted bottle had gotten him, was long and deep. Was going to leave a scar, but so what? What was a scar or two between friends? And they were friends, weren't they? Yeah, the old Kansas Street gang, the Crimson Pirates with their plastic swords, and battery-powered Star Wars ray guns. Once they had done something heroic. Twice, if you counted the Rickenhauer girl. They had even gotten their pictures in paper at that time. So what if he had few scars? And so what if they once maybe, just maybe, killed a guy? Because if there was a guy who deserved killing, but he wasn't going to go there either. No way, baby. He saw the line though. Like it or not, he saw the line more clearly than he had seen it in years. Primarily, he saw Beaver and heard him too, right in the center of his head. Jonesy, you there, man? Don't get up, Beav, Pete said, watching the flames crackle and climb. The fire was hot now, breathing warmth against the fire, making him feel sleepy. You stay right where you are. Just sit tight. What exactly was all this about? What's all this joba noba, as the Beav himself had sometimes said when they were kids, a phrase that meant nothing but still cracked them up. Pete sensed he could know if he wanted to. The line was that bright. He got a glimpse of blue tiles, a filmy blue shower curtain, a bright orange cap, Rick's cap, McCarthy's cap, old Mr. I Stand at the Door's cap, and sensed he could have all the rest if he wanted it. He didn't want it if this was the future, the past, or what was happening right at this minute. But he could have it if he wanted it. If he... I don't, he said, and pushed the whole thing away. There were a few sticks and twigs left on the ground. Pete fed them into the fire, then looked at the woman. Her open eye had no menace in it now. It was dusty, the way deer's eyes got dusty after you shot it. All that blood around her. He'd supposed she'd hemorrhaged. Something inside had gone bust, hell of a tough break. He supposed maybe she had known it was coming and had sat down in the road because she wanted to be sure of being seen if someone came along. Someone had, but look at how it turned out. Poor bitch. Poor unlucky bitch. Pete shifted to the left, slowly, until he could snag the top, then began to move forward again. It had been her makeshift sled. Now it could be a makeshift shroud. I'm sorry, he said. Becky, or whatever your name is, I'm really sorry, but I couldn't have helped you by staying, you know. I'm not a doctor. I'm a fucking car salesman. You were fucked from the start. And now he had meant to finish, but the words dried up in his throat as he saw the back of her. That part hadn't been visible until he got close, because she had died facing the fire. The seat of her jeans was blown out, as if she finally finished farting fumes and had gotten down to the dynamite. Torn rags of denim fluttered in the breeze, also fluttering were the fragments of the garments she'd been wearing beneath. At least 2 pairs of long johns, one heavy white cotton, the other pink silk. And something was wrong on both the legs on the jeans and the back of her parka. It looked like a mildew or some kind of fungus. Red glow, or maybe that just reflected firelight. Something had come out of her. Something. Yes, something, and it's watching me right now. Pete looked into the woods. Nothing. The flood of animals had dried up. He was alone. Except I'm not. No, he wasn't. Something was out there. Something that didn't do well in the cold. Something that preferred warm, wet places except it got too big and it ran out of food. Are you out there? Pete thought that calling out like that would make him feel foolish, but it didn't. What it made him feel was more frightened than ever. His eye fastened on that sketchy track of that mildewy stuff. It stretched away from Becky. Yeah, she was Becky, all right. As Becky could be, and around the corner of the lean-to. A moment later, Pete heard a scaly scraping sound as something slithered on the tin roof. He craned up, following the sound with his eyes. "Go away," he whispered. "Go away and leave me alone. I'm fucked up." There was another brief slither as the thing moved farther up the tin. Yes, he was fucked up. Unfortunately, he was also food. The thing up there slithered again. Pete didn't think it would wait long. Maybe couldn't wait long. Not up there. It would be like a gecko in the refrigerator. What it was going to do was drop on him. And now, he realized a terrible thing. He had gotten so fixated on the bear that he had forgotten the fucking guns. His first impulse was to crawl deeper into the lean-to, but that might be a mistake. Like running into a blind alley. He grabbed the jutting end of one of the fresh branches he just put on the fire instead. He didn't take it out, not yet. Just made a loose fist around it. The other end was burning briskly. "Come on," he said to the tin roof. "You like it hot? I got something hot for you. Come on and get it. Yum fucking yum." Nothing. Not from the roof, anyway. There was a soft flump of snow falling from one of the pines behind him as the lower branches shed their burden. Pete's hand tightened on his makeshift torch, half lifting it from the fire. Then he let it settle back in the little swirl of sparks. "Come on, motherfucker. I'm hot, I'm tasty, and I'm waiting." Nothing. But it was up there. It couldn't wait long. He was sure of it. Soon it would come. Time passed. Pete wasn't sure how much. His watch had given up entirely. Sometimes his thought seemed to intensify, as they sometimes had when he and the others were hanging with Duddits. Although as they grew older, Duddits stayed the same. There had been less of that. It was as though their changing brains and bodies had lost the knack of picking up Duddits' strange signals. This was like that, but not exactly like that. Something new, maybe. Maybe even something to do with the lights in the sky. He was aware that Beav was dead, and that something terrible might have happened to Jonesy, but he didn't know what. Whatever had happened, Pete thought Henry knew about it, although not clearly. Henry was deep inside his own head, and he thought, Banbury Cross, ride a cock horse to Banbury Cross. The stick burned down further, closer to his hand, and Pete wondered what he'd do if it burned down too far to be of use. If the thing up there could outweigh him after all, And then a new thought came to him, bright as day and red with panic. It filled his head, and he began to cry it aloud, masking the sound of the thing on the roof as it slithered quickly down the slope of the tin. "Please don't hurt us. No place, pa." They would. Because what? Because they are not helpless little ETs. Boys waiting around for someone to give them a New England telephone card so they can phone home. They are disease. They are cancer. Praise Jesus. And boys, we are one hot radioactive shot of chemotherapy. Do you hear me, boys? Pete didn't know if they did, the boys to whom the voice spoke, but he did. They were coming, the boys were coming, the Crimson Pirates were coming, and not all the begging in the world could stop them. And still they begged, and Pete begged with them. "Please, don't hurt us, please." Weeping now, "Please, for the love of God, we are helpless." In his mind, he saw the hand, the dog-turd, the weeping, nearly naked boy. And all the time, the thing on the roof was slithering, dying but not helpless, stupid but not entirely stupid, getting behind Pete while he screamed, while he lay on his side by the dead woman listening to some apocalyptic slaughter began. "Cancer," said the man with the white eyelashes. "Please," he screamed, "please, we are helpless." But lie or truth, it was too late. The snowmobile had passed Henry's hiding place without slowing, and the sound of it was now receding to the west. It was safe to come out, but Henry didn't come out. Couldn't come out. The intelligence which had replaced Jonesy hadn't sensed him, either because he was distracted or because Jonesy had might somehow still be. But no, the idea that there could be any of Jonesy left inside that terrible cloud was so much dream work. And now that the thing was gone, receding at least, there were the voices. They filled Henry's head, making him feel half mad with their babble, as Dad's crying had made them feel half mad, at least until puberty had ended most of that crap. One of the voices belonged to a man who had said something about a fungus, dies easily until it gets on a living host. Then something about a New England telephone card and chemotherapy? Yes, a big hot radioactive shot. It was the voice, Henry thought, of a lunatic. He had treated enough of them to judge. God knew. The other voices were the one which made him question his own sanity. He didn't know all of them, but he knew some. Walter Cronkite, Bugs Bunny, Jack Webb, Jimmy Carter, a woman he thought was Margaret Thatcher. Sometimes the voices spoke in English, sometimes in French. He was astounded and exhilarated to find there were still tears in his heart, from which he thought all tears and all laughter, true laughter, had fled. Tears of horror, tears of pity, tears that opened the stony ground of self-regarding obsession and burst the rock inside. "There is no infection here. Please. No, God, stop! Don't! Don't!" Then the human thunder began in the west, and Henry put his hands on his head, thinking that the screams and the pain in there would tear it apart. The bastards were slaughtering them. Pete sat by the fire, unmindful of the bellows of pain from his separated knee, unaware he was now holding the branch from the fire up inside his temple. The screams inside his head could not quite drown out the sound of the machine guns in the west, big machine guns. .50s, now the cries, "Please don't hurt us, we are defenseless, there is no infection," began to fade into panic. It wasn't working, nothing could work, the deal was done. Movement caught Pete's eye, and he turned, just as the thing had been on the roof struck at him. He caught a blurred glimpse of a slender, weaselly body that seemed powered by a muscular tail rather than legs. And then its teeth sank into his ankle. He shrieked and yanked his good leg toward him so hard he almost clocked himself in the chin with his own knee. The thing came with it, clinching like a leech. Were these the things that were begging for mercy? Fuck them if they were. Fuck them!